Smell hit first. Before the voices, before the footsteps, before the metal scrape of the ladle against iron. Corn. Boiling corn. The scent crawled through the stone walls of the holding room, like a ghost from another life, wrapping itself around the boy's throat until he couldn't breathe without tasting it. His small body went rigid on the dirt floor. His eyes, which had learned to stay empty and far away, suddenly flooded with something his parents hadn't seen in weeks. Recognition. Memory. And then, without warning, tears. His mother's hand shot to his mouth, rough and fast, muffling the sound before it could escape. But it was too late. The cry had already broken free, a single sob that seemed to carry the weight of every meal they'd never eaten, every fire they'd never lit, every night they'd slept with stones for pillows and hunger for blankets. The father didn't move. He sat against the wall, one leg stretched out, the other bent, his head tilted back against cold stone. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was counting guards, hours, distances, the pattern of boots on packed earth. He'd been counting for 9 days. The fort was quiet at this hour, late enough that most soldiers had retreated to their quarters, early enough that the night watch hadn't fully settled into their routines. It was the perfect time. The lock on the door was old, the hinges loud but manageable, if moved slowly. The father had studied it for days, memorizing the exact angle at which the metal groaned, the precise pressure needed to lift the door before pulling. He knew the route. Through the back corridor, past the supply shed, over the low wall near the horses where the wood had rotted and never been replaced. 3 minutes, maybe 4 if the boy was slow. They could disappear into the desert before dawn, become shadows again, untraced and untraceable. He'd planned it perfectly. But now there was this smell, and his son was crying. The mother pulled the boy closer, her hand still pressed over his mouth, her body curved around his like a shell. She whispered something in their language, low and urgent, but the boy wasn't listening. His small hands clutched at her arm, not pulling it away but holding on, as if the scent itself might vanish if he let go. His grandmother had made corn like this, boiled in clay pots over open flame, seasoned with salt traded from the river people, served on nights when the harvest had been good, and the family gathered in circles, passing bowls and stories in equal measure. He'd been 4 years old the last time he tasted it, 4 years old the last time he'd sat in his grandmother's lap and felt her hum vibrate through his back as she sang the old songs. 4 years old when the fevers came and took her in 3 days. He didn't remember her face clearly anymore, but he remembered that smell. The door opened, not violently, not with the sharpness of an order or the threat of inspection. It opened slowly, almost apologetically, the way someone enters a room where they know they're not entirely welcome. A figure stood in the frame, backlit by the dim glow of lanterns hung along the corridor. Tall, broad-shouldered, an older man, his uniform worn at the edges, his face shadowed, but not hidden. He held a pot in both hands, steam rising from it in pale ribbons that curled toward the ceiling. He didn't speak, didn't step inside. He simply stood there, holding the pot like an offering at an altar, and then, after a long moment, he bent down and placed it on the ground just inside the threshold. The mother's grip on her son tightened. Her eyes never left the soldier. She was searching for the trap, the trick, the moment when kindness would reveal itself as cruelty in disguise. She'd seen it before. Food laced with something that made you slow, made you compliant, made you forget why you needed to run, or food as bait, left to see who was desperate enough to take it, who could be controlled through hunger. She didn't trust the pot. She didn't trust the man. She didn't trust the smell that was now filling the small room like smoke, thick and inescapable. The soldier straightened. He looked at them for a moment longer, his expression unreadable in the low light. Then he turned and walked away. His footsteps faded down the corridor, steady and unhurried, until there was only silence again, and the pot, and the smell. The boy twisted in his mother's arms, his eyes fixed on the pot. He wasn't crying anymore, but his breath was uneven, his small chest rising and falling too quickly. The mother looked at her husband. The father's eyes were open now, staring at the pot as if it were a living thing, something dangerous and coiled. He didn't move. didn't speak. His jaw was tight, the muscle along his neck taut like rope pulled to breaking. Outside, the wind picked up. It carried the sound of distant voices, laughter from somewhere near the barracks, the low whinny of a horse settling into sleep. The desert beyond the fort walls stretched endlessly in all directions, cold and unforgiving under a sky thick with stars. Out there, survival was a language they spoke fluently. Hunger, thirst, cold. These were familiar enemies, predictable in their cruelty. But this warmth inside a stone room, this smell that felt like memory made solid, this was something else entirely, something they didn't have words for. The boy moved first. He slipped from his mother's arms, not forcefully, but with the quiet determination of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be argued with. He crawled toward the pot on hands and knees, his small shadow stretching long across the dirt floor. The mother reached for him, her hand catching the back of his shirt, but she didn't pull him back. She froze, torn between instinct and something deeper, something that had no name but felt like grief. The boy reached the pot. He looked back at his parents, his face small and pale in the dim light, and then he reached inside. The corn was still hot. He pulled a single piece free, steam rising from his cupped palm, and brought it to his mouth. He bit down. The taste flooded his senses. Salt. Sweetness. The soft give of cooked kernels. And something else, something he couldn't name but felt in his bones. Comfort. Wholeness. The feeling of being fed not just by food, but by care. His eyes closed, and for the first time in months, he smiled. It wasn't a large smile. Barely there, really. Just a slight upward curve at the corners of his mouth, a softening of the tension that had lived in his face since the day they'd been brought here. But it was enough for his mother to see. Enough for his father to feel like he'd been struck. The father's hand curled into a fist, not in anger, in something worse. Shame. Deep, bone-deep shame that settled into him like sand in water, heavy and impossible to shake free. He was the provider, the protector, the one who brought food home, who taught his son to hunt, to track, to read the land like a map written in stone and sky. And now his son was eating from the hand of a stranger, a man in uniform. The man whose people had taken their land, their freedom, their future, and his son was smiling. The mother's hand fell away from the boy's shirt. She stared at him, at the joy on his face, and something inside her cracked, not broke, cracked, like ice on a frozen river when the thaw begins, slow and inevitable. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, refusing to let this place, these walls, these men, take anything more from her than they'd already stolen. But now, watching her son eat, watching him smile, she felt the weight of every choice she'd made and every choice she hadn't been allowed to make. The boy ate another piece, then another. He didn't rush. He savored it, the way children do when they've learned that good things are rare and must be held onto tightly. His small fingers moved through the pot, finding the sweetest pieces, the ones where the kernels were plump and full. He ate quietly, almost reverently, as if the corn itself was sacred. The mother moved toward him, slowly, her knees dragging across the dirt floor, her body folded in on itself like a wounded bird. She reached the pot and sat beside her son. He looked up at her, his face still soft with that small, fragile smile. She reached into the pot. Her hand trembled. She pulled out a piece of corn, held it in her palm and stared at it as if it might speak to her, might explain how the world had become so strange that this single act felt like both survival and surrender. She ate. The taste was familiar. Too familiar. It tasted like her mother's hands, like the fire pits of her childhood, like a life that no longer existed except in memory and in the smell of boiling corn. She chewed slowly, her throat tight, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Beside her, the boy ate again, his small hand reaching into the pot with the easy confidence of a child who trusted that there would be enough. The father hadn't moved. He sat against the wall, his legs still bent, his head still tilted back, but his eyes were open, watching, his son, his wife, the pot between them, the choice being made without words. He felt something rise in his chest, something hot and sharp and unbearable. It wasn't anger, it was loss. The loss of control, the loss of the plan, the loss of the man he'd been before this place, before the hunger, before the moment his son had cried at the smell of corn cooked by someone else's fire. The boy turned to him, held out a piece of corn in his small, outstretched hand, an offering, an invitation. The father stared at it, at his son's face, at the hope that still lived there despite everything, and he understood in that moment that the war had already taken something from him that no weapon could touch. It had taken his right to feed his own child. It had taken the simple, sacred act of providing, and no escape, no flight into the desert, no return to the old ways would ever give that back. He pushed himself off the wall, moved toward them, sat down beside his wife. The boy placed the corn in his father's hand. The father looked at it, held it, and then slowly he brought it to his mouth. He chewed, swallowed. The taste was ash. But he ate anyway. They ate together in silence, the three of them, huddled around a pot that didn't belong to them, in a room that wasn't theirs, in a life that had been chosen for them by forces they couldn't see or name. Outside, the wind continued to blow. Inside, the fort continued its nightly routines. Guards changed shifts. Fires burned low. Somewhere in the barracks, the old soldier lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a boy he'd never see again, a son who died in a place whose name he couldn't pronounce, and wondering if the smallest acts of kindness could ever balance the weight of what had been done. The mother finished first. She pulled her hand from the pot and wiped it on her skirt, then reached for her son, pulling him into her lap. He curled against her, his stomach full for the first time in weeks, his eyelids heavy. She began to hum. Quietly at first, so quietly it was almost just breath. But then louder, strong enough to carry. It was an old song, a song her mother had sung, a song about the harvest, about gratitude, about the cycle of seasons and the continuity of life, even when life itself seemed broken. The boy's breathing slowed, deepened. He was falling asleep, safe, fed, warm. The mother kept humming, her voice steady even as tears finally slipped free and ran down her cheeks in silent streams. She was singing for her son, for her mother, for the life they'd had and the life they might never have again. She was singing to prove that even here, even now, even in this stone room with walls built by strangers, she was still herself. Still Apache, still a mother, still alive. The father listened. He didn't sing. He couldn't. His throat was too tight, his chest too full of something he had no words for. But he stayed. He sat beside his wife and son, his hand resting on the boy's back, feeling the rise and fall of small breaths, the warmth of a body no longer trembling with cold or hunger. And he wept, silently, without sound. Tears that fell onto his folded hands and disappeared into the dirt floor like rain on dry earth. The pot sat between them, empty now except for a few stray kernels at the bottom. It wasn't much, just corn, just a meal. But it had done what no lock or guard or wall could do. It had stopped them, not through force, but through something more complicated, something that felt like kindness, but tasted like defeat, something that fed the body but starved the spirit. Or maybe in some way neither of them could yet understand. It had done the opposite. Maybe it had reminded them that survival wasn't just about escape. It was about choosing in each small moment what kind of people they would be, what they would teach their son, what memories they would carry forward. The night deepened. The boy slept. The mother's song faded to silence. The father sat motionless, his hand still on his son's back, his mind far away, walking through deserts he might never see again. The plan was gone. The escape route memorized and now meaningless. The perfect moment had passed. And in its place was this, a family together, in a room that smelled like corn and memory and the complicated, unbearable grace of being seen as human by someone you'd been taught to fear. The door remained unlocked. The father knew this. He could still hear the hinges in his mind, still see the route through the dark corridors. But he didn't move, not because he couldn't, but because something had shifted. Something fragile and unnameable had taken root in the space between hunger and hope, and he wasn't sure yet if it was strong enough to carry them forward, but he knew with a certainty that made his chest ache that it was real. Morning would come. Decisions would need to be made. The world outside these walls would continue its slow, grinding turn. But for now, in this moment, they sat together. A father who had lost the right to provide, a mother who sang to preserve what couldn't be taken, and a boy who smiled at the taste of corn and didn't yet understand that some gifts carry the weight of entire histories. They sat, they breathed, they existed in the terrible, beautiful space between who they'd been and who they were becoming. And somewhere in the barracks, an old soldier closed his eyes thinking of his own son and wondering if anyone had ever shown him kindness in the moments before the end, wondering if small acts mattered in a world that seemed built on large cruelties, wondering if a pot of corn could ever mean anything more than just a pot of corn. He didn't have answers, only questions, and the faint, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, being human to one another was enough. Even when everything else had been lost. The wind died down, the stars turned overhead, and in a small stone room in a fort that would one day be forgotten, a family chose to stay. Not forever, not without question, but for tonight, for this moment, for the warmth of a full stomach and the sound of a mother's song and the weight of a sleeping child who still believed, in some deep and unshakable way, that the world could be kind. Some encounters change what we think of those we've been told to fear. They don't erase history. They don't undo harm. They don't solve the impossible contradictions of survival in a world that seems determined to divide us into categories of worthy and unworthy, human and other. But they do something smaller, something quieter. They remind us that beneath the uniforms and the languages and the borders drawn in blood and treaty, there are people, flawed, afraid, trying in their fumbling, inadequate ways to do something good. And sometimes on nights when the smell of corn fills the air and a child smiles for the first time in months, that's enough to make us pause, to reconsider, to choose, if only for a moment, connection over escape. The father would think about this night for the rest of his life. He would never fully forgive himself for eating that corn, but he would also never forget the feeling of his son's breath against his hand, steady and peaceful. And he would understand eventually that some choices aren't about honor or shame. They're about love, and love, in the end, is the only thing that survives when everything else has been taken. If stories like this one, quiet and human and complicated, touch something in you, stay with us. Subscribe so that memories this delicate, this true, are never forgotten.